Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into, well, a really critical turning point in American history, Andrew Johnson's presidency.
Right, during Reconstruction, 1865 to 69.
Exactly. And you think about those initial hopes, for unity, for real freedom after the Civil War,
Yeah, hopes for equality.
and they just crash headfirst into these massive political fights. Progress feels incredibly slow.
It really does. And this deep dive is for you listening to really get a handle on how the country was trying to rebuild, find some common ground, and figure out what freedom even meant.
What citizenship meant in those, really raw post-war years.
And maybe pull out some key lessons,
Yeah.
about how social change works or sometimes just doesn't. Lessons that still hit home today.
Definitely. And to get the full picture, we've pulled together some pretty diverse sources.
We have. There's a historical overview from Wikipedia, the Vietnamese edition, actually, which can offer slightly different angles sometimes.
Interesting. And we've got in-depth analysis from the Miller Center at UVA.
Plus, a cultural analysis piece helps grasp the bigger picture, the societal shifts.
And, crucially, insights from the Jim Crow Museum about the really stark racial realities.
Yeah, so the mission is to pull the most important insights from all these different takes on this pivotal time.
Okay, let's dive in then. The war ends. Lincoln's assassinated just, 6 weeks after Johnson becomes VP?
Yeah, it's incredibly fast.
So what's the initial feeling? What plans were even on the table at that point?
Well, it's interesting. There's this immediate uncertainty, but also a couple of potential paths. Initially, after all the previous threats to Lincoln, there was actually, believe it or not, some relief among Republicans that Johnson survived.
Because he was a Southerner who stayed loyal.
Right, a Unionist Democrat. Now, as for plans, Lincoln himself, his ideas were evolving. Earlier on, he was leaning towards getting Southern states back in quickly, minimal demands.
Loyalty oaths, abolish slavery, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But by the time he died, he was actually considering suffrage for some black men, specifically those with property, maybe education.
That's a pretty big shift, even if it wasn't fully fleshed out policy yet.
It is. But there were definitely tougher ideas floating around, too.
Like Secretary of War Stanton, right? He had a different vision.
Oh, definitely.
Mm.
Just before Lincoln died, Stanton laid out a much harder line to the cabinet. His plan involved military rule in the South, pretty strict conditions for states to get back in.
Wow, so a really different approach from Lincoln's earlier idea.
A significant departure, yeah.
Mm.
Very assertive federal role.
So right off the bat, you've got these competing visions, and it sounds like a key sticking point right from the start was black suffrage. Who gets to vote? Why was this so critical for the Republicans?
Well, think about the stakes. Republicans had a few big worries. First, they were genuinely concerned that if you didn't let black men vote, and you didn't stop Confederate leaders from regaining power.
The old Southern power structure just comes right back.
Exactly. They basically reimpose racial control, undermine the whole point of the war. And politically, that can let the Democrats, maybe reunited, take back Congress, even the presidency.
Republicans were still a relatively new party then, right? Their grip on power felt shaky.
Very shaky. So the black vote wasn't just moral. It was seen as strategically vital for keeping Republican strength.
But there was a moral side, too.
Oh, absolutely. You had black soldiers who fought for the Union. You had formerly enslaved people with powerful hopes for real freedom, real rights, and abolitionists like Sumner and Douglas were pushing hard.
They couldn't just ignore those voices.
No way. So it was this mix of political calculation and real moral conviction driving the Republicans.
Okay, let's turn to Johnson then. Southern Democrat, but stayed with the Union. Where did he land on all this?
Yeah, this really gets to the core of Johnson's thinking. He believed strongly in the Union, but he had a very, very strict view of the Constitution. Big emphasis on states' rights.
But not the right to secede, obviously.
No, not secession. He kind of echoed Lincoln's earlier point.
Yeah.
Individuals might be traitors, but the states themselves never legally left the Union.
So his Reconstruction idea was?
Well, set some conditions for return, sure. States had to abolish slavery in their constitutions. Voters needed loyalty oaths. But, and this is key, he was dead set against requiring black suffrage for readmission.
So end slavery, yes. Black voting rights, no. That's a huge difference.
Huge. Sets the stage for a major clash.
And it looks like he moved fast, didn't he? Used the time Congress was out of session in '65. What did his presidential reconstruction actually involve on the ground?
It's striking how quickly he acted, and kind of unilaterally. April to December '65, he basically ran the show. He appointed provisional governors of the ex-Confederate states.
And told them to do what?
Organize state conventions, their main jobs. Write new constitutions that abolish slavery and renounce secession. Once that's done, elect new governments, send people to Congress, and boom, in Johnson's view, the state is back.
Okay, who got to be part of this? We know about loyalty oaths, but what about the ex-Confederates themselves?
So his amnesty policy said most Southern voters just had to swear loyalty to get a pardon. But there were big exceptions.
Like who?
Former federal officials who joined the Confederacy, West Point or Annapolis grads who fought for the South, high-ranking Confederate officers and leaders. Oh, and the really wealthy rebels, people with lots of taxable property who'd helped the cause.
So what do they have to do?
They had to apply directly to Johnson, personally, for a pardon to get their political rights back.
And this is where it gets weird, right?
Yeah.
Because he ended up pardoning a ton of them. Why? Why so lenient with the old elite all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Historians point to a few things, probably a mix. Johnson's own racism, definitely a factor.
Some say he kind of enjoyed having the planter class have to come crawling to him.
That's one theory, yeah. That power dynamic. Plus, his belief in states' rights let the states handle their own affairs.
Maybe trying to build a new political base for himself?
Possibly. Trying to pull together conservative Democrats and Republicans for '68. And then there's the more cynical take. Maybe he thought even if black men did vote, the planters would just control their votes anyway.
So the old power structure stays, but maybe poor whites get sidelined a bit?
Could be. Whatever the reasons, the result was clear. A lot of the pre-war elite got back into power really fast.
And what did these newly empowered or re-empowered Southern states do? It wasn't exactly kumbaya and equality, was it?
Not even close. I mean, some conventions did grudgingly abolish slavery, maybe renounce secession and the debt, though many resisted even that. But almost all of them immediately passed what we know as the Black Codes.
Black Codes, we hear that term. What were they specifically?
Well, they varied state by state, but the goal was the same everywhere. Restrict freedom, restrict opportunity for black people, basically force them back into subservient labor on the plantations.
How? What kind of restrictions?
Oh, things like needing permits to be off plantation land, strict curfews in towns, having to sign year-long labor contracts super early, or risk being arrested for vagrancy.
Vagrancy, even if they were just looking for work.
Right. And maybe the worst part was the apprenticeship systems. They could bind people, even adults in their 20s, to employers without parental consent. It was basically involuntary servitude all over again.
Unbelievable. What else?
Often banned from owning or renting land. Rights to hunt, fish, carry guns, graze animals usually gone, and state institutions, schools, orphanages, almost always excluded black people.
So these weren't just minor rules. They were meant to rebuild the old economic order.
Absolutely. Recreate slavery's economic conditions, just, with a different legal name, freedom in name only.
A really grim picture. So Congress finally comes back in December 1865. They see all this. What's their reaction?
Predictably, they were not happy. Deeply dissatisfied. The Republican majority immediately set up the Joint Committee on Reconstruction to investigate Johnson's policies.
And they refused to seat the new Southern representatives.
Flat out refused. And wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of those new state governments Johnson had set up. This was the start of a long, really bitter fight between Congress and the president. 2 years of it.
And it seems like Johnson's resistance actually pushed the Republicans together, made them more determined?
Ironically, yes. His strong opposition to black suffrage, his vetoes of things he saw as infringing on presidential power, it kind of unified the Republicans, pushed them towards what became military reconstruction, making sure black civil and political rights were actually guaranteed.
We see his opposition with the vetoes, right? The Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act of '66. Remind us what those were about.
Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau extension that was about continuing this vital federal program, aid, shelter, resources for displaced, formerly enslaved people. It also proposed military trials for people violating black civil rights.
And Johnson vetoed it.
Vetoed it, yeah. And used really overtly racist arguments, claiming it would make Southern blacks dependent. Congress, though, overrode the veto.
And the Civil Rights Act. That sounds major.
It was landmark. It defined anyone born in the U.S. except Native Americans as a citizen. Spelled out basic rights, testify in court, own property, equal protection under the law.
Johnson vetoed that, too.
Yep, said it violated states' rights. Probably hoped to tap into anti-black feelings up north, but again, Congress overrode him.
That override was huge, wasn't it? First time for major legislation.
A massive moment. Really showed Congress's growing power and determination.
Which leads right into the 14th Amendment. What drove that? What did it do?
Well, with all this tension, And Johnson clearly trying to block civil rights. The Joint Committee drafted the 14th Amendment. They worried the Supreme Court might kill the Civil Rights Act later.
So they wanted something permanent in the Constitution.
Exactly. Passed in June '66, it was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Defined national citizenship for the first time, gave the federal government power to protect citizens' rights.
And it dealt with representation too, right? The 3/5 clause.
Repealed the 3/5 clause, yes.
Mhm.
And it said if a state denied the vote to any male citizens, with some exceptions for rebellion, its representation in Congress would be cut proportionally.
And when southern states rejected it,
Congress basically said, fine. Ratifying this is now a requirement for getting back into the Union.
yeah.
Non-negotiable.
Wow. So the lines are drawn for a big fight in the 1866 elections. Southern whites are hoping things swing back their way.
They really were, hoping for a backlash against the Republicans.
But Johnson's campaigning, that swing around the circle, it didn't go well.
It backfired spectacularly.
Mm-hmm.
He went on this unprecedented personal campaign tour, trying to rally support for his side. But his speeches were often just aggressively racist.
Attacking his opponents personally.
Yeah, and it alienated a lot of moderate Democrats, undecided voters. The result,
Yeah.
a huge Republican win. They got a 2/3 majority in both houses.
Game changer, which allows them to push through radical or military reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 sounds like a total shift.
It's fundamental. Passed in March '67, over Johnson's veto, of course. It basically threw out Johnson's state governments,
And replace them with,
divided the South, except Tennessee, into 5 military districts, put them under martial law.
under military governors.
Yep, appointed by Congress.
Yep.
And to get back in the Union, states had to hold new constitutional conventions, elected by universal manhood suffrage. That meant black men voting.
And these conventions had to do what?
Write new state constitutions that ratified the 14th Amendment and guaranteed black male voting rights. The military governors had broad powers to enforce this, protect people.
And Congress made the final call on readmission.
Absolutely. Only after these new governments did everything Congress demanded could they even be considered. Congress kept the final say.
And they kept adding to it more acts.
Yeah, a few supplementary acts between March and July '67. They gave the military commanders even more power, like initiating the conventions themselves, validating them based on votes actually cast.
To get around white boycotts.
Exactly. And it made it clear. Commanders followed Congress, not Johnson. By late '67, most southern states held these conventions, mostly run by Republican coalitions, white Southerners who supported Reconstruction, Northerners, and the newly enfranchised freedmen.
So by mid-1868, several states were back in.
7 southern states readmitted by June 1868 under these new rules.
Meanwhile, Johnson's watching his whole plan get dismantled. Congress starts limiting his actual presidential powers too, right? The Command of the Army Act, Tenure of Office Act.
Direct responses to him trying to block everything. The Command of the Army Act said he had to issue military orders through General Grant.
Who couldn't be removed without Senate approval.
Right. And the Tenure of Office Act, same day, said he couldn't fire certain federal officials, crucially cabinet members, without Senate consent.
Aimed squarely at protecting Secretary of War Stanton.
Absolutely. Stanton was a key ally of the radical Republicans. They wanted to keep him there.
And Johnson defying that act is what triggers impeachment. Walk us through that.
That's the fuse. August '67, Congress is out. Johnson sacks Stanton anyway, appoints Grant as interim secretary.
But when Congress came back,
The Senate refused to approve Stanton's dismissal. Grant then kind of broke with Johnson over it. Then, February '68, Johnson fires Stanton again.
and the House reaction.
Immediate. They voted to impeach him right away, even before drawing up the specific charges.
Then they wrote the articles.
11 articles, yeah. Mostly about violating the Tenure of Office Act, the Command of the Army Act, but also charges like bringing disgrace to the presidency through his actions and rhetoric.
So the president is on trial in the Senate. What were the main arguments?
The House managers laid out their case in March '68, Chief Justice Chase presiding. Johnson's lawyers argued basically that he fired Stanton deliberately to test the Tenure of Office Act's constitutionality.
And that his actions weren't high crimes and misdemeanors anyway.
Exactly. Didn't meet the constitutional bar for removal.
And the vote. Incredibly close.
Unbelievably close. May '68, the Senate votes,
Yeah.
35 vote to convict, 19 acquit. 1 vote short of the 2/3 needed.
Wow. 1 vote.
Subsequent votes on other charges, same result. They adjourned the trial. He stayed in office, but just barely.
Why? Why did he survive? It sounds like so many Republicans wanted him gone.
Several factors. Some senators genuinely weren't sure his actions legally counted as impeachable offenses.
Politics, too. Fear of who came next.
Definitely. The successor would have been Benjamin Wade, president pro tempore of the Senate, a real radical, but he had some unpopular economic ideas that made some senators nervous.
Chief Justice Chase kept things narrow.
Chase insisted on sticking strictly to the charges, didn't allow a broader trial about Johnson's whole conduct, and it's thought some moderate Republicans, maybe Grant supporters, were willing to acquit.
Possibly because Johnson promised to back off obstructing Reconstruction.
That's the theory, a sort of implicit deal. Stop fighting us, and you can finish your term.
So he stays, but he's basically powerless. What's the long-term effect of this whole impeachment saga on the presidency itself?
Well, Johnson was finished politically, no influence left. His presidency is often seen as the start of a weak presidency era. Woodrow Wilson later called it congressional government.
Power shifted to Congress, committees, cabinet secretaries.
For a while, yes. The impeachment, even though it failed, definitely acted as a check on presidential power, shifted the balance.
Okay, let's pull back from the Washington politics for a minute. What about the broader culture? How was everyday life changing or maybe not changing during Johnson's time?
Yeah, this is where the Jim Crow Museum insights are so vital. Defining freedom wasn't just a debate in Congress. It was happening on the ground in communities all over the South.
You had formerly enslaved people trying to build lives, right?
Absolutely. Incredible resilience, building churches, schools, trying to get involved politically, often with help from the Freedmen's Bureau, which was crucial.
But, as we said, massive resistance from white Southerners.
Fierce, often violent resistance. They were determined to keep the old racial hierarchy. You see the rise of the KKK, groups like that, using terror and intimidation.
And the black codes themselves are part of that cultural resistance.
For sure. A legal way to try and keep black people down, recreate that economic subservience. The whole period was this intense ideological battle over race, who's a citizen, how much power the federal government should have.
And even with the big amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th getting passed, that promise of real equality just didn't happen. Why was it so hard to make those laws stick in reality?
The cultural resistance was just immense, so deep-seated, this pervasive belief in white supremacy, this irrational fear of racial mixing.
The idea that social equality automatically leads to interracial relationships.
Right, which was seen as this ultimate threat. And the willingness to use violence to keep the racial order intact. All of that worked against the constitutional changes. Implementing big social change is never simple, especially when it hits core beliefs and power structures.
And this resistance eventually hardens into the Jim Crow system. The museum calls it more than just laws, a whole way of life, legitimizing racism. What were the core ideas? What did it look like day to day?
It's chilling, really. The core beliefs, absolute white superiority in everything, this deep fear of miscegenation, interracial relationships, threatening racial purity.
And the idea that any social equality would lead there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And violence was seen as, well, necessary to keep black people in their place, socially and economically. The museum highlights this through, like, everyday etiquette.
Things we wouldn't even think about.
Right. A black man offering his hand to a white man. Dangerous.
Yeah.
Black and white people eating together in public. Forbidden. A black person not using Mr. or Mrs. for a white person could get you hurt or worse. Even simple things like who steps aside on the sidewalk.
Specific rules for everything.
Unspoken, sometimes spoken, all reinforcing dehumanization. Stetson Kennedy documented rules for how black people had to talk to white people, never imply equality, never contradict, never laugh.
And then the actual laws?
Yeah.
Equally pervasive.
Absolutely. Legally mandated separation. Separate schools, hospitals, prisons, water fountains, restrooms, you name it. And separate always meant unequal. Always inferior, often non-existent for black people.
And Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court case?
That 1896 decision gave it the legal stamp of approval. Separate but equal was the doctrine, but in reality, equality was a total fiction.
And voting rights systematically denied.
Completely undermined. Poll taxes you couldn't afford, literacy tests designed for you to fail, whites-only primary elections, all designed to block black men from voting, despite the 15th Amendment.
Jim Crow laws covered everything. Barbers, blind wards, burials, buses.
Child custody, education, libraries, mental hospitals, militia, nurses, prisons, reform schools, teaching, even selling alcohol. Every facet of life, segregated and controlled.
And underpinning all of it, the threat and the reality of violence.
Crucial. Jim Crow is enforced by law, yes, but also by extra legal means. Violence was the ultimate tool of control.
Black people challenging the system risked everything.
Jobs, homes, their lives. White people could often assault black people and face zero consequences. The justice system was all white, offered no protection, no recourse.
And the most extreme form of that violence, lynching.
Yes. The
Yeah.
statistics are just horrific. The Jim Crow Museum historical records, they show thousands of victims.
Over 4,700 between 1882 and 1968.
Documented cases, yeah. And overwhelmingly, the victims were black men, women, children. Early on, more white victims, but as Reconstruction went on and black people asserted rights, lynching became this primary tool of racial terror.
To keep people in their place.
Exactly. Often happened where black people were becoming economic competitors or just challenging the social order in some way.
And the justifications were often lies, like
Right.
false rape accusations.
That was a depressingly common pretext, almost always baseless, but used to whip up the mob.
Yeah.
And the police often participated or just looked the other way, sent a clear message. Black lives didn't matter to the authorities.
And it wasn't just individual lynchings. There were mass attacks, race riots.
Yeah, the riot is often the wrong word. They were more like pogroms, mass lynchings, white mobs attacking entire black communities. Wilmington, 1898, Atlanta, 1906, Tulsa, 1921, the Red Summer of 1919.
Destroying homes, businesses, killing people.
Systematically, often sparked by white aggression, fueled by rumors. Police frequently siding with the attackers. The goal was pure terror, maintaining white supremacy by force.
And any black resistance was met with a deadly force.
Absolutely. Resisting often meant death.
So, looking back at Johnson's presidency through this whole lens, the politics, the culture, the violence, how do historians see his legacy now?
It's pretty consistently viewed as a major missed opportunity, a chance for a much more just, more lasting reconstruction that was squandered.
Because of his policies. His racism.
His policies, his racism, his constant fighting against Congress's efforts to secure basic civil rights for black Americans, it's all seen as having seriously slowed down progress, maybe even set it back.
And contributing to the rise of Jim Crow.
Yeah, the cultural resistance he seemed to encourage, the political compromises made partly because of his obstruction, they definitely helped pave the way for Jim Crow and delayed true equality for generations. It's a heady legacy.
A really sobering, critical period to understand.
Sure.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway you want listeners to hold on to about Johnson's presidency and Reconstruction?
I think it's that Johnson's presidency is just this stark, powerful reminder of how incredibly hard it is to achieve real racial equality and national unity, especially after a huge divisive war.
The promises of Reconstruction that went unfulfilled.
They had consequences,
Yeah.
long-lasting, far-reaching consequences that, we're still dealing with today in many ways.
It really makes you think about the parallels, doesn't it? The echoes between Reconstruction's challenges and, well, issues we face now around social change, racial justice, political divides. They feel pretty undeniable.
They really do. And I think this deep dive into the failures but also the struggles of Reconstruction leaves you with a really important question to think about. How does really understanding this history, the good, the bad, the tragic, how does that inform how we approach building a more just, more equitable society today? What lessons can we actually learn and use from this experience?